Yeah, it works.
1, 2, 1, 2. Working! Yeah!
Okay. Hey everyone. So today we're going to talk about EntraGoat. EntraGoat is a deliberately vulnerable Entra ID environment designed to simulate real-world attack scenarios in your own Entra ID tenant. And before we'll jump into everything, we'll talk about ourselves just for a few sentences. So my name is Tomer. I'm a security research team lead at St. Paris.
And my name is Jonathan. And by the way, Tomer is my boss. So yeah, on our day-to-day job, we are basically researching various identity-related attacks, mainly in the Microsoft ecosystem, so Active Directory, Entra ID, and even a little bit on Okta.
So what are we going to talk about today? At first, we're going to give a little bit of a background story to what are Goat projects and why we developed EntraGoat. Then we're going to jump to identity is the new perimeter. This phrase comes up very often. And we're going to talk about why identity security is important. Then we're going to talk about privilege escalation paths in Entra ID. And then EntraGoat finally. And of course, the scenarios inside EntraGoat. So, Goat projects. Before we talk about everything, any one of you tried a Goat project before? AWS Goat, Azure Goat? Not many. Okay, maybe this will be.
Yeah. I see hands.
That's nice. So Goat projects are a family of deliberately vulnerable environments in different types of fields. It can be CI/CD, it can be AWS, it can be Azure, it can be many other stuff. They intentionally emulate attack scenarios and attack paths in the environment. And it looks like a CTF. And it's pretty cool. You try to learn, you try to break stuff. Very recommended. And that leads us to why we didn't develop EntraGoat. So first thing, we love CTFs. We think CTFs are a great way to learn anything in the security world. Jonathan told me today, well, he didn't tell me today, he reminded me again today that when he started doing security, he actually started with doing CTFs because it's not only teaching you theoretical stuff, it also helps you try stuff yourself, again, hands-on experience with breaking stuff. And Entra ID was missing its own Goats project. Like we said, there's AWS Goat, Azure Goat, CI/CD Goat, and we wanted to create one for Entra ID because we love Entra ID. And the last thing, we wanted to make Entra ID more accessible for everyone. We know many people these days have interest in identity security, in particular in Entra ID because it's very much connected to Azure. You cannot have an Azure subscription without an Entra ID tenant connected to it. So we wanted to create something so everyone can try and break Entra. Identity is the new perimeter. This phrase, like I said, comes up very, very often these days. What we learn is that by acquiring an identity of any security principle, you can bypass many network restrictions, such as getting into a VPN, going through a firewall. So now you can breach the perimeter without even breaching the perimeter. You just need to acquire an identity of this organization. If we ask Claude how many sources cite this phrase, we can see there's over 100 sources that says this, but probably there's thousands. Pass the microphone to Jonathan without passing the microphone.
Thank you. So this phrase, identity is the new parameter, it's really a buzzword at this point. And in my opinion, it's not correct anymore because it's not the case anymore. It's non-human identities are the new parameter. And let me maybe double-click on that issue. So if we take the latest report by Microsoft from 2024 about the state of multi-cloud security report, can you read it, by the way? Okay, so guys, hear me out here. They're right. Today, there are one human identity for every 10 workload identities. Workload identities are basically service account identities, non-human identities. This problem is even more acute among small and medium-sized businesses, which have one human identity for every 50 workload identities. So there's a lot of workload identity, service principals identities. And in addition to that, they even mention out of the 209 million cloud identities identified in 2023, 50% plus were super identities. So you might be wondering, okay, 50%, it's not that bad. What even a super identity can do? So from the same report, guys, and let me read it out for you. Super identity, a user or a workload identity that has access to all permission and all resources across your entire cloud estate. In my opinion, this is not super identities. It's super, ultra, duper, pro max identities, okay? And I even add to that, there were 3 human super identities for every 7 workload super identities. So if we take that into consideration, it's not identity, it's non-human identities are the new perimeter, and indeed, it's broken. And what's last metrics? 2% of all assigned human and workload identity permission were used. So we have like 50x more permission than needed. The same thing applies to the next one. And guys, this is by Microsoft, right? The guys that produced this product. And if we talk about Microsoft, let's take an example straight from their time when they got breached by APT29, Midnight Blizzard. This happened, I think, in early 2024. So basically, Mitiga wrote a full report on what happened, allegedly happened. But at the end of the day, the attack path is very, very straightforward, okay? So APT29 got access by password spraying a legacy test account in their legacy test tenant. Again, the words here are very, very important because I'm sure that many people went over this document in order to save any trouble for Microsoft. But again, a legacy test account got compromised, then but somehow it got an ownership over a legacy OAuth application, and that application has an identity inside Microsoft's own corporate tenant. And maybe this connection might seem a bit, I don't know, unclear how they move from one tenant to another. So let me just elaborate a bit on that. So whenever you deploying an application in your Entra ID environment, you're basically creating 2 identities, not 1, but 2, okay? The first thing is the application registration, which is an identity that have all the scope defined in it, all the blueprint of the application, all the redirect URIs in it. But it's not the security principle, meaning it's not the right principle that get access to all the resources. This is the service principle itself. So the application registration define all the scopes and all the blueprint regarding the identity, but the security identity behind the scene is the service principles. So you can define in one tenant the application itself and then deploy it into another tenant and basically have this connection from legacy of application to a service principle. And the moment we read that report, we knew that we wanted to include it in our EntraGoat scenarios, and we did exactly that. If you will be able to see here the mark line, they say by Mitiga, the app role assignment read-write all in particular suggests the attacker could assign app role and manage permission across the tenant, a capability that will significantly amplify their access and control over corporate resources. And we were like, okay, so basically, let's recreate that. Let's recreate that attack path exactly as it is without the initial access, because there are many ways to get initial access to a given tenant. And we did just like that. We created the first 2 scenarios you will encounter when entering EntraGoat are those, taking control over a service principle and using its authentication context in order to privilege escalation and move laterally within the tenant. Okay. And by the way, one last thing. This highlights the importance of service principles inside the tenant. And in fact, service principles shape, in our opinion, the current landscape of privilege escalation in Entra ID.
Yeah, so now that we know why security, identity security is important, we're going to talk about what is going on in Entra. It's a mess, but it's a beautiful, complex mess. So there's in modern Entra ID environments, it's not just gold mine for attackers. There are so many privilege escalation paths that it's crazy. You have over-permissioned applications, stale group memberships, mismanaged service principals, and just general misconfigurations that happens in an Entra ID environment on a regular basis. All of which can lead to a total tenant compromise with just a few steps. And we put a lot of emphasis on that in EntraGoat, because you will see, it just takes a few steps to go from a low-privileged user into a total tenant compromise. Service principals, Jonathan just said that non-human identities are very important and we think are the most critical objects in your environment because they are unique, important, and very dangerous. They have usually long-lived passwords and certificates that you can use to authenticate as the service principal, and they operate differently than users. They operate in an app-only context, and it lets you bypass security controls like MFA and conditional access policies. And for those of you who don't know, conditional access policies are like GPOs in Active Directory. It's a very big thing, in our opinion. But you don't just need to believe us when you say there's a lot of attack paths in Entra ID. You can look at Microsoft and what they published, that 58% of organizations have at least one attack path in their environment. 7% have over 1,000 attack paths in their environment. That's probably thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of organizations. And on average, there's 351 attack paths in any organization.
Those are big numbers, if you ask me, by the way, guys. Yeah.
So just to reiterate what we said in the beginning, EntraGoat is an open source, deliberately vulnerable Entra ID environment that's designed to simulate real-world attack scenarios in a test tenant in a CTF-style for you to have fun. So this is how EntraGoat looks. We designed it ourselves, and the UI was made by ourselves using Claude. There's 6 challenges in different difficulty levels. There's beginner, intermediate, and advanced. For each challenge, you have a unique story to give you a real-world feeling for this scenario. You have the starting credentials. It can also be a certificate. You have a setup script and a cleanup script that we'll talk about in a second. You have a place to submit a flag because it's a CTF after all. And there's hints to build on top of each other in case you need them, but looking at you, I don't think you need any of them.
Okay, so maybe to talk about a little bit more about our goal behind developing EntraGoat. So we wanted to draw more attention to the whole Entra ID ecosystem, and we did it by developing the EntraGoat, which is very, very beginner friendly. So even if you never touch Entra ID, you can jump right in, follow the steps, and learn basically on your own how to exploit the whole tenant. Okay, so as you saw earlier in the UI itself, there are 3 beginners scenarios, 1 intermediate and 2 advanced. Okay, again, really pushing on the points that we wanted to make it very, very beginner friendly. And by the way, everything is written in native PowerShell and Microsoft Graph SDK. So there isn't any third-party tooling importing in that. You can basically read the solution scripts for each scenario and understand what's going on. There is everything from enumeration to exploitation being done there. And by the way, we got a lot of question, how much does it cost to deploy the scenarios? It costs 0 because Microsoft basically charges you on resources, not on identities. Okay, so when I develop it with Tomer, we maybe deploy around 1,000 scenarios, and our cost still remains 0. So it doesn't cost much. And a bit more about the challenges themselves. Each challenge comes with 3 unique files. Okay, the first file is the setup script. So basically, you run the PowerShell script in order to deploy the vulnerable environment into your own test tenant. Then you have a cleanup script because we do not want to leave your tenant vulnerable to any attacks after you learn the module. And we also have a full solution walkthrough and a blog post on the Semperis website on how to solve everything and all the background behind each attack. So the cost of each of the tool, we get a lot of the question about it, but the second most popular question we get is, can we run it in production environment? I kid you not, guys. It's a true question. It's a true question. You should not run them in production environment. Guys, it's a deliberately vulnerable deployment. Do not run them in production. Okay, so let's jump right into the scenarios. We're going to go through over the 6 scenarios. If you have any question throughout the presentation themselves of the scenarios, just raise your hand and we can do it like that. Okay. The first one, as we previously saw, is very simple. You are a low privilege user that have an ownership over a privilege service principal, which has the role of PEA, which is Privilege Authentication Administrator. This role can basically reset and set every password for any user in the tenant. So in Microsoft Entra ID, ownership is a feature because you want to delegate administrative actions. So a low privilege user can be an owner of a high privilege service principal. And the attack path is very, very straightforward. You basically add a client secret to the service principal. You authenticate in the app-only context, meaning you operate in the context of the application itself. And that way you can get its privileges and reset the global admin password. Very, very straightforward. Again, really beginner-friendly, just to grasp the initial understanding of what it looks like to operate from an application context. The next scenario, again, very, very simple. You're getting a certificate, and you're getting asked to find which identities belong to this certificate. You enumerate the environment, and you find out that it belongs to Cooperate Finance Analytics application. And if you remember this role permission we saw earlier in the Mitiga report and on how Microsoft got breached by APT29, this is the exact same scenario, guys. Okay, so the solution for that is, again, very, very straightforward. You use the certificate, you authenticate as the service principal, and then you're using the app role assignment read-write-all permission in order to grant yourself another permission, because basically what this permission allows you is to grant yourself or to any identity in the tenant another permissions. So you grant yourself a privilege permission, which is role management read-write directory, which allows you to grant any identity in the tenant any role you want. So you use it in order to grant yourself the global admin role, and then you basically re-authenticate in order to refresh the JWT token and reset the password of the global administrator. Okay, those were the 2 straightforward scenarios. The third scenarios introduce a little bit more complexity to the attack chain, to the attack path, but again, it relies on previous experience you gain in those initial scenarios. This is how it looks. Again, you have ownership over a group this time, not a service principal identity, but it's basically the same thing. If you're an owner of a group, you can add yourself as a member to that group, and then you can inherit all the privilege those groups has. That group has. This is how it looks, the attack path. So if you're an owner of a privileged group that has the role application administrator, you can basically add a secret to you can basically backdoor any service principal within the environment. So what you do in this scenario, you add yourself to the group. The next step is going to add a backdoor to a privileged service principal. That service principal is also a member in a given group, a privileged group, and you use it in order to reset the password of the global administrator. Again, we're literally building the knowledge of the attack path in Entra ID. Scenario number 4, again, very, very similar to scenario number 3, but we added another component to the mix, and that is PIM, which basically allows you to set a specific time or activation period in which you can activate a given role. or ownership. So a low privilege user has eligible ownership over a privileged group, and the attack path looks like this. You activate the ownership. First thing first, you find the ownership. I know it looks very straightforward, the attack path. You go from A to B to C, but in the scenario themselves, we really try to make them realistic. So there are multiple identities deployed in each scenario. So you don't have just one eligible ownership over a given app admin. You have like 5, and you have to understand which of those groups are able to help you to privilege escalation your way forward in the tenant. Okay? In addition to that, you need to activate the role that the group itself has, and then just like in scenario number 3, you can set tap temporary access password on the global administrator. Any question this far, guys? Yeah. Get back to scenario number 1. 3. Okay, so in order to add yourself to a group, you don't need anything to be exact.
Okay.
If you are a group owner, you basically can manage the group, and you can add whenever you want, each identity you want to that group. So there's no need to any other more allowance, basically.
Okay, then I may have mixed it up when you add another application that has to be granted first, right?
What? Sorry?
If you have an application that's been granted access specifically, then that has to run over global admin, right? I think so.
I didn't understand the question, I'm sorry.
Okay, I come back to you after the talk.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so those were the 4 first scenarios. The 5th and 6th scenarios are a bit more complex, and because we wanted to explore different attack paths that are not beginner-friendly, but much more complex, but more fun, and show more features within Entra ID. So, scenario number 5, which is called Department of Escalation. Are you ready for this? Okay. So, once you authenticate to the tenant as a low privilege user, you enumerate the groups that you are part of and the eligible membership in other groups. And just like the previous example, in scenario number 4, you found yourself that you have 2 eligible assignments. One for eligible owner of a privileged group that have a very specific scope in which it's privileged on, okay? It's called administrative unit. And you find you also have eligible membership in a custom role. Again, user profile administrator is not a built-in role within Entra ID. It's a custom role we built in order to showcase that even the least privileged permissions, such as user basic update, can cause a lot of harm if you don't use them correctly. Okay, so this very basic action, it's called in documentation, user basic update can update and change any properties on any identity within the tenant. It's basically a feature for IT admins in order to change departments, to change name, to change basic properties. But if you combine it together with a privilege role over a specific AU, okay, that means that this group is only privileged on that specific AU, only on the HR department users. But if you combine the attack path from above with the one down there, you understand that you can edit any properties on any user you want, so you can cause it to be added into the AU, and then you have control over it, so you can reset its password. Okay? Very, very realistic scenario, by the way. Scenario number 6 is our most complex one, and it's indeed complex. Let me walk you through the short version of it, because we don't have a lot of time. One interesting point to say is that you can't assign a service principal ownership over another service principal ownership. You can't do it via the UI, the Azure portal or the admin center, but you can do it through the direct API call, and we did solve that in many of our customers because it's really useful for automation tasks. Okay, so instead a user manage another service principal. Let's make it automated that a service principal specific can manage another one. It's a really useful feature. But again, this can be exploited, and the exploitation is very simple. In that case, is that if you're an owner, like we said earlier, you can add yourself, you can add a backdoor access to it and authenticate to it. So in this case, there are 3 steps. You first authenticate as a Terence McKenna user to the, as the service principal, then you authenticate, you add a backdoor secret to the other service principal, and you find out that service principal has the role, the permission of organization read write all. This permission basically can add any root certificate of authority to the tenant, but it's not useful if you can't authenticate with a certificate to the tenant. So the above attack path basically allows you to enable CBA, certificate-based authentication in the tenant, and that way you can combine those two together and add a root CA, a evil root CA to the tenant, and then use it to sign a certificate for the global admin, and then authenticate with that certificate as the global administrator. That's it on a very, very speed run of the scenarios. Thank you, guys. Any questions? There's one, sir. Yes, of course. So okay, so the permission itself, organization read write all, allows you to manage the org-wide configuration in the tenant. There are many org-wide configurations in the tenant, such as branding, such as metadata for the organization, a lot of stuff. But one of them, and it's very hidden in the documentation of Microsoft, by the way, is the ability to add your own certificate of authority to the tenant, okay? So in this attack path, you literally create your own private key, you deploy with OpenSSL certificate of authority, and you add it to the root tenant. Did I answer the question or miss it completely? Yes and no, both. You can have more than one certificate of authority in the tenant. You can have like 5. So if you add another one, there's no problem in that. If I didn't answer it fully, please come afterward. I will be glad to talk about it for more time if I didn't answer it correctly. Any more questions, guys? Over there.
Hello. So as you said, Entra ID is super complicated, right? And I'm curious about your opinions on if you feel like Microsoft has taken enough responsibility to reduce some of that complexity for sysadmins who have to spend quite a bit of time learning the ins and outs of the permissions and what's possible with each one, especially related to workload identities. And then second question, what would you recommend Microsoft change with the workload identity experience to make it easier for sysadmins to do correctly?
Oof, those are really two big questions. The first question was about, do we think Microsoft are doing enough? And the answer to that, I think, is yes. In my opinion, at least, I think they're doing enough. It's a really long answer, but I'll keep it very, very short. And I say that each big system will have its own complexities and difficulties to manage, okay? And in my opinion, the more configurable you make it to be, the more you can do with that. So that's, for example, why I really love Android and hate iOS, is because I can configure my phone differently. So I see those things as features, not as bugs. But again, the place for a lot of misconfiguration and mismanagement really cause it to have a lot of attack path in each Entra ID environment. And the second question, please remind me, I already forgot.
What would you change with the user experience? Or like, what would you change with how
Oh, it's a hard question. What would I change? I think I will start by making them one identity. Instead of you having two identities, one application registration and one enterprise application, service principals, I will just make it one. And all the management will be on that. One last thing, guys, we'll finish. We have like 6 shirts like this, merch, if you want. So the first 6 to come to us will have this awesome shirt. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.